Hello, everyone. So thank you for taking time to join us today. We have this really interesting session on unlocking SDG finance through integrated national financing frameworks for inclusive, sustainable, and resilient pathways in LDCs. And my name is Haoliang Xu. I'm a UN Assistant Secretary General and UNDP's the Director for UNDP's Bureau for Policy and the Program Support. I'm really happy to welcome you all to today's event. First, let me say that we're here today to really talk about how LDCs are unlocking SDG finance through integrated national financing frameworks for inclusive, sustainable, and resilient pathways. The integrated national financing frameworks, or INFFs, are highlighted by the Doha Program of Action as a prominent mechanism to strengthen SDG financing. We have a fantastic panel discussion today, this evening. But first, it is my pleasure to welcome the Administrator of UNDP, Mr. Achim Steiner, okay, so before I announce what he will do, okay, so you're popular, Achim. So really, I would like to invite Mr. Achim Steiner to open the event and share, some insights into some of the trends that UNDP sees across the countries it is supporting to develop INFFs. Mr. Achim Steiner, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you very much, Haoliang. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, also my colleagues from the United Nations family. I am very pleased to be sort of the warm-up act because the real experts are going to come in a moment. But in wanting to perhaps just frame a little bit this afternoon's discussion, which is taking place in the context of LDC5 and the Doha Joint Program of Action, let me begin by recognizing that what we're dealing with right now in virtually all of the LDCs and well beyond the LDCs in developing countries in general, including quite a number of middle-income and even some upper middle-income countries, is a period of profound disruption, enormous fiscal stress and constraints, and increasingly the concern that a debt load, a debt level that has been accumulated becomes increasingly unsustainable in terms of the rapid escalation in interest rates and therefore the cost of borrowing. But much of what led us, and my dear colleague Junhua is also here, and Omar from UNICEF and many others who are in the room here, is that in the United Nations, we go back a little bit when we talk about INFFs to really the pandemic, because it was in the pandemic and the early socioeconomic assessments that the UN supported across the world when it supported countries in the first 6 months to try and identify where would the most vulnerable be found, how could you respond to them, that it became increasingly clear as time progressed that many countries would very quickly hit a point at which fiscal space became an absolute barrier, not only in coping with the crisis, but actually to be able to invest forward, to come out of this crisis. Now, many of us will remember that a year and a half ago, we were talking about building forward better. Now we're kind of struggling to hold on, I think is probably the best way of describing the state of our both global political, but also geo-economic reality. Junhua and I have both been in New Delhi. Junhua, as the Sherpa attending the Indian presidency's hosted Ministers of Foreign Affairs meeting that took place just now. I was in Bangalore attending the Finance Minister's Central Bank Governors meeting. And let me tell you, from the perspective of LDCs, of developing countries, of countries that are facing debt distress now, potentially as a very real next step, there is not yet a great deal of good news. The reality is that the G20 has been struggling to stand up a response that is commensurate and rapid and scalable enough to be meaningful to the degree to which countries are now facing very serious debt. 25 of the 51 countries that we have in an assessment deemed to be countries that are faced with major debt problems and issues right now are already spending a fifth of their revenue, 20%, just on servicing debt. We have a real problem. And so what the United Nations decided about a year ago is that it would offer to developing countries the opportunity to have this instrument, the integrated national financing frameworks, not as an instrument that is a response by those who will be future creditors who are considering stepping in, providing additional funding, whether it's the IMF or the World Bank, but truly as an instrument that is driven from a national perspective to assess all sources of funding and financing available to a developing country at that moment. Domestic, international, concessional, private, public, and out of that construct essentially a practical and pragmatic response to what is an impossible situation for many, namely enormous needs, trying to recover from the pandemic, dealing with the cost of living crisis, cost of capital, and yet diminished resources. This in many ways is at the moment the bottom line for many countries. As we meet here in Doha, we are very pleased that there have actually been many countries who have found this extremely useful. Today, we are in the process of supporting 86 developing countries with these integrated national financing frameworks. They are not a UN template or imposed set of financial analysis terms, but really are a tool to let the country make its own decisions about where to prioritize in a moment of scarce resources, its investments. Let us perhaps just say a couple more words on where it is that we are also trying to, beyond the immediate framing of how countries can allocate resources, also recognize that there are structural challenges. For instance, low tax revenues. There are still many developing countries that are at a level around 5% of, in comparison to 10, 15, 20% in other countries. We need to also look at the revenue potential of developing countries. Then there are short-term developments, such as the new international minimum tax, the 15%. Many developing countries are only just beginning to realize that if they don't revisit the taxation levels that they often offered to foreign direct investors, let's say at 5% or 7%, if they don't review these and now charge the 15%, then essentially it will be the Internal Revenue Service in the US or the German tax office or the UK tax office that will actually collect the difference between the 7% and the 15%. Developing countries, according to our colleagues in the OECD who have done some scenarios here, may find themselves with an additional revenue stream of up to $100 billion if they were to, in fact, look very carefully at these tax differentials and how to collect them. So taxation, in the sense of not only revenue generation, but then also allocation with the SDGs, is an issue we are also trying to address here. But let me quickly move on and simply say that the INFs at the moment, from the perspective of how we are learning with many countries to support them, represent a vital platform to ultimately mobilize and align financing. The way that we are able to do this in partnership with them, I think, and very rapidly, has been to some a surprise, but I think to many countries a relief. And I don't want to go into the detailed examples now because some of our panelists will speak to that in a moment. But I can tell you that with each INF that we are involved with, and UNDP being a principal partner in this partnership of the UN, we are learning to do it better and also to add more nuances to it. I think this is a tool, hopefully, that we will see many least developed countries using and taking it forward in terms of the more than 160 prioritized reforms that help align public and private finance with the SDGs that have already been identified. And I'm delighted that we will have the opportunity to hear about these results directly from 4 LDCs today. Yet realizing these in-country-led visions to transform their national financing architecture that INFFs represent will require commensurate levels of support, technical assistance, capacity building, South-South exchange, and learning. The United Nations will provide that. UNDP is very committed to supporting countries, but it is not something we can do either in isolation, or do we wish to do so. We need to do it with partners and with many who are willing to also step forward at this moment. Let me end by drawing attention to one last element, which relates again to how this links to the broader financial and geoeconomic reality. Last month, the UN Secretary General presented an SDG stimulus plan. And in fact, he invited Junhua and I to present it to the media about 10 days ago. And that SDG stimulus plan is in fact a larger way of framing the financial and economic conundrum that we face as a global family of nations right now. But within that, the Secretary General very clearly identified the INFFs as an immediate tool, part of that rapid response capacity, while we begin to address the more structural issues. In his SDG stimulus plan, he outlines a number of measures that relate to injecting liquidity in the short term, rescheduling, restructuring debt, but also addressing the issue of how developing countries can get to a point where lower cost long-term borrowing becomes more feasible. This links to the debates that are currently ongoing about World Bank reform, for instance, but also IMF, SDRs. These are all part of a larger basket that the SDG has called for urgent attention to be given to right now. Namely that the international financial architecture, the way the system is failing us in this crisis, needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed very much also through the leadership of the G20. Let me end by thanking those of you who have invited us to work with you in your countries on these integrated national financing frameworks. Let me thank also our donors and partners who have enabled us to very rapidly stand up this response through the SDG Joint Fund also, and the INFF Facility that is now supported by the DESA, OECD, UNICEF, the European Union, and the governments of Sweden, Italy, and Spain, as we launch that facility to be able to scale up and deliver more rapidly the kinds of inputs that are sought from us. With that, I think, Hao-Liang, I have hopefully warmed up the room enough, and you are excited by what is coming, because, colleagues, this is a kind of emergency response, but built into it already the notion that there is a recovery. There will be a way of coming out of this crisis, but a lot of it has to do with how we manage the short-term financial crisis, the debt crisis, and the priorities of investment. And I think INFFs have been a remarkably insightful and useful practical tool in that pursuit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hakim, for this illuminating remarks, insightful, and you clearly demonstrated that as LDCs in this really very challenging global financing landscape, and LDCs do face deeper and more severe challenges than many other countries. But you also pointed out in many ways, possibly that we can find the solutions and how INFFs might be able to help. So thank you very much for this opening remarks. And now let's turn to our panel discussion. I have the pleasure now to invite the panelists to come on the stage. And so these are
I go there.
You go there. Okay, fine. You can stay here if you wish. Right?
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So so I would like to invite His Excellency Mr. Ilyas Musa Dawale, Minister of Economy and Finance of Djibouti, and Mr. Li Junhua, Under Secretary General of UNDESA, and Mr. Omar Abdi, Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, and Mr. Abdul Reza Ibrahim, the Secretary General of the Government of Comoros, and we have also Her Excellency Ms. Fonavan Otavan, the Vice Minister of Ministry of Planning and Investment, Laos, PDR, And then we have Ms. Mami Mizutori, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction. And then we also have Her Excellency Ms. Heidi Romberts, Vice Minister of Development and Cooperation, Belgium. Please come to the stage. Okay, so please.
Okay. Hello, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Really appreciate your participation, your time and the participation in this. Following Akin's remark, right, and we see that really many LDCs are taking INFF as a tool to deal with the financing challenges, to provide a pathway forward. It is really exciting to note how many LDC governments were where we are working, actually taking this up. So we will hear from some of these governments, as well as from the international partners who are providing support in this common endeavor. Let me first invite to kick off the discussion. Let me invite our first speaker, okay, and His Excellency Mr. Ilyas Musa Dawale is the Minister of Economy and Finance in Djibouti. Djibouti began exploring the INFF approach in 2021 and is using its INFF to develop a financing strategy for the country's medium-term development plan called Inclusion, Connectivity, and Institutions. Your Excellency, please, can you please tell us about Djibouti's experience with the INFF process and about some of the reforms that are emerging from the INFF, for example, in tax and other areas of financing policy? Minister, the floor is yours. I think we have also a presentation, right?
OK, merci. Je pense qu'il y a une... Je vais vous laisser mettre les casques pour ceux qui ne sont pas francophones. Mais je vais déduire les timings de mes 8 minutes apparemment. Hein. On est bien d'accord, monsieur le modérateur. Non, c'est un plaisir d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui à cette occasion. Et merci à l'équipe du PNUD avec qui nous entretenons plus généralement avec le système des Nations Unies à Djibouti d'excellentes relations depuis quelques années. Je vois le résident coordinateur ici dans la salle et nous apprécions à juste titre le travail collaboratif que nous avons depuis quelque temps, depuis longtemps. Pour ce qui concerne de l'exercice de INFF, je voulais très rapidement, avant d'aller sur le slide, donner peut-être un très bref historique sur la façon dont c'est venu par rapport à Djibouti. Comme beaucoup de pays, nous avons vécu le Covid de façon très difficile. Et le Covid est arrivé à peu près vers la fin de notre premier plan quinquennal appelé SCAP, Stratégie de croissance accélérée pour l'emploi en République de Djibouti. Et donc, nous étions en train de travailler sur le nouveau plan quinquennal appelé Djibouti ici. Le premier I pour inclusion, avec C pour connectivité, et le deuxième I pour institution. Donc, c'est vraiment les 3 piliers fondamentaux de notre plan quinquennal sur lequel nous étions en train de préparer avec des priorités transversales, notamment sur le capital humain, sur le changement climatique, mais également sur le digital. Et donc, pendant que nous étions en train de préparer ces plans, le deuxième de sa génération, la pandémie est arrivée. Nous avons, entre autres, également vécu d'autres crises. Avant de vivre la crise de l'Ukraine, nous avons vécu plusieurs autres crises, dont une est régionale, notamment sur l'instabilité et en particulier des conflits à l'intérieur de l'Éthiopie, mais également d'autres conflits au niveau de la Corne de l'Afrique, notamment avec la Somalie. Et en même temps que le Covid, nous avons connu également une sécheresse extrêmement aiguë avec tous les changements climatiques et ses conséquences. Donc, il fallait tout reprendre avec ces différents défis et s'assurer que nous apportions des réponses rapides pour la pandémie, mais également d'apporter une réponse à tout ce reste de ces défis. Donc, c'est ce que nous avons essayé de faire. Et pendant ce temps, nous étions sur la voie de graduer des pays de PMA. Nous faisons partie de ces 5 pays qui sont censés, pour les années à venir, graduer de LDC. Graduer des LDC avec tous ces défis, mais également faire face à toutes ces crises pendant que nous étions en train de connaître à peu près les 10 dernières années, un PIB multiplié par 3, pardon. Avec 200 milliards de francs Djibouti, c'était en 2011, c'est-à-dire à peu près il y a 10 ans de cela, nous étions avec un PIB de l'ordre de 220 milliards de francs Djibouti, 1,5 milliard. Avec en 2020, tout au moins pour ne retenir que la période avant Covid, de 610 milliards de francs Djibouti. Donc, un PIB multiplié par 3. Mais tous ces efforts et tous les gains qu'il y a eu pendant ces 10 années ont été remis en cause par ces différentes crises et en particulier par la crise du Covid et naturellement un peu plus tard pour ce qui concerne de l'Ukraine. Comment donc financer pendant que les ressources sont commencées à devenir rares, et c'est beaucoup plus vrai maintenant avec cette crise géopolitique mondiale. On le constate malheureusement. On a eu un bouffée d'oxygène avec la solution qui a été présentée par le G20. Tout à l'heure, quelqu'un parlait du G20 et donc du moratoire. Pour nous, on s'est retrouvé avec ces moratoires, une autre crise de la dette. Je pense à M. Hakim qui parlait tout à l'heure donc de la crise de la dette. Nous étions en train de vivre une vulnérabilité en termes de financement de la dette, en tout cas, le service de la dette. Et cette vulnérabilité s'est accélérée après la fin du moratoire de 2 années. Djibouti, comme beaucoup d'autres pays, s'est vu le service de la dette multiplié par 3 tout d'un coup, sachant que nous allions reprendre donc le paiement de nos dettes. Mais en même temps, les ressources commençaient à manquer. Il fallait donc imaginer quel modèle de financement. Et c'est là où vraiment nous avons trouvé cet outil INFF extrêmement utile parce qu'on a non seulement appris beaucoup de possibilités pour financer nos ressources, y compris les ressources à mobiliser au niveau domestique, mais on a appris également sur la réalité de nos propres ressources. On a appris notamment que durant les 10 dernières années, tous les financements qu'il y a eu avec ce développement rapide de Djibouti, cette croissance Et cette multiplication du PIB sur 10 années par 3 était principalement financée par des ressources nationales, par des épargnes. Ça n'était pas financé par le financement du développement, entre autres. Ça n'a pas été financé que essentiellement par la dette, parce que la narration qu'il y avait ou la narrative qu'il y avait autour de Djibouti, c'était un financement et des infrastructures principalement venant, entre autres, par exemple, de la Chine. Et ça a prouvé que les ressources, beaucoup de financements, des projets structurants sont venus de ressources locales. Mais ces ressources locales n'étaient pas suffisantes. INFF nous a permis, entre autres, de découvrir, notamment pour ce qui concerne en termes des capacités. On a découvert nos propres fragilités avec l'exercice de l'INFF. En termes de coordination, moi je suis ministre des Finances, mais très bizarrement, en tout cas par rapport à beaucoup de pays, le ministère du Budget est plutôt indépendant. Il n'est pas sous le ministère des Finances. Et même si nous avons une relation de travail. Nous avons vu, entre autres, nos lacunes en termes de coordination. Nous avons vu également nos lacunes en termes de gestion, en raison, entre autres, donc, de cette absence de cohérence, plus généralement, des politiques publiques. Donc, nous avons développé d'autres instruments, toujours avec le PNUD des systèmes des Nations Unies. Quand je parle de PNUD, je ne dois pas être mal compris par l'UNICEF, parce que c'était un exercice en commun, mais avec les leads de l'UNDP. Nous avons fait donc tout ce travail pendant ces dernières années, pendant ces 2 dernières années. Nous avons donc également calculé les besoins qu'il y avait en termes de financement. On sait aujourd'hui très exactement quel type de financement nous avons besoin et pour quel secteur. Nous savons également avec l'INFF quelles sont les capacités à mobiliser en termes de ressources du secteur privé et surtout de financer par rapport aux objectifs des ODD, parce que tout cela sont également liés. Voilà, grosso modo, un peu vraiment l'exercice que nous avons vécu pendant ces dernières années avec l'INFF. Et donc, d'autres instruments se sont naturellement imposés à nous. Entre autres, dans la foulée, on a développé, et cette fois-ci, c'est avec la Banque mondiale, l'exercice PFA que nous n'avons jamais réalisé. C'est le Public Finance Performance Diagnosis, diagnostic des finances publiques, pour également sortir des lacunes très détaillées de la gestion des finances publiques, parce que l'INFF nous a mis en lumière l'intérêt de plus de qualité de gouvernance, de plus de transparence dans la gestion des ressources financières pour le développement. Nous avons développé un autre outil et je pense qu'en Afrique, nous sommes parmi les premiers avec la plateforme du PNUD pour le secteur privé qui se trouve à Istanbul. ICPCD, c'est un peu compliqué comme nom, mais c'est la plateforme qui est chargée de la promotion du secteur privé dans les pays en voie de développement. Une très bonne institution qui nous a permis également, avec qui nous avons travaillé pour faire le premier exercice de SDGs Investment Map, justement pour également essayer de mobiliser ces ressources nécessaires, ces ressources du secteur privé, ces ressources domestiques dans des secteurs stratégiques, en tout cas que nous considérons à fort potentiel de développement et de transformation.
Minister,
je vais finir très rapidement parce que
if you can wrap up because of the time issue, please.
Not just to complete my presentation, and the lesson learned from the exercise is we now look really much more seriously in creating the right environment in terms of collaboration, promoting private sector as a number one in investment vehicle ou le moteur en termes d'investissement, and en même temps de travailler sur la qualité de la coordination de l'aide pour peu que cette aide continue à arriver à Djibouti. Les lacunes que nous souhaitons, donc, et je profite de la présence de l'administrateur du PNUD et de l'ensemble de l'équipe dirigeante, maintenant qu'on a tous ces exercices, il y a beaucoup de travail qui a été complété avec vos équipes. C'est la mise en œuvre maintenant, the implementation. Comment maintenant mettre en œuvre sur les moyens et long terme pour que désormais vraiment nous puissions également sortir très efficacement et très sérieusement, et donc pour graduer en d'autres termes de ces LDC tels que nous sommes en train de les planifier. Plus de ressources en termes de capacité, en termes d'accompagnement pour la mise en œuvre de tout ce qui a été fait pendant ces longues années et appelons également les partenaires vraiment à plus d'efforts et de mobilisation des ressources. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Minister. I really hate to interrupt the Minister, and you are giving such an exciting example, in my view, on how, INF has been a journey of discovery in a way, and how, INF is guiding, the implementation of national strategies. This is really fascinating. But thank you very much for these insights. And also, you ended on a question that is still to be answered. How do we mobilize resources to achieve these national aspirations? Thank you very much. Let me turn now to DESA. DESA is an important partner in this endeavor. DESA is the secretariat for the UN Interagency Task Force on Financing for Development. And it's really an important partner in shaping the methodological guidance for countries developing INFFs. And the UN DESA is also a core partner of the INFF Facility. So I would like to give the floor to Undersecretary General Lee. And I know you have to leave a bit earlier after you speak, but can you please share with us your perspective on the national context that LDCs are in today? And how, is UN DESA supporting LDCs in the area of financing? And what do you see as the priorities lobbying, looking forward, right? So what would be really as the priorities for moving forward? And we gave, national representatives a bit more time than the UN colleagues and international colleagues. So you have a few minutes than the minister. So thank you. Please, over to you.
Well, thank you, Hao Liang, for giving me the floor. It's very delighted and great honor to join this panel discussion. Just now we heard the very inspiring open remarks from Achim Steiner. That I became a bit of a warm-up already. And that also we have heard the very successful story from the Djibouti about how this IMF have integrated into your national development strategy to mobilize additional resources to sustain the SDG implementation and your development strategy. So that I guess the very title for this, the topic for this our discussion is unblocking the financial resources or sustainable development. And the global economy is facing multiple shocks, as we all shared it, and the high uncertainties. The global situation is made worse by the tightening of monetary policies across the globe and the growing risk of the debt distress. As Artin just now shared with all colleagues, 60% of all LDCs and other low-income countries are either at the risk of debt distress or already facing it, leading to the financial instability and the limited space to make the much needed investment in sustainable development harder. All colleagues is aware in coming September, SDG summit is going to be held in New York, and we are going to take the midterm review of this whole exercise to see that how we could accelerate the implementation. But the financing issue is an overarching challenge, not only for the LDCs, but almost it's for almost all the global south. So the international community needs to step up. That is why the Secretary General has launched the stimulus, the SDG stimulus, to ensure that all countries can respond to the both immediate and long-term challenges. That package actually asked us to deliver a massive increase in development financing, at least $500 billion per year, through a combination of concessional and non-concessional finance. And it calls on the international community to address the debt overhangs in vulnerable countries, particularly in LDCs. So by operationalizing the SDG stimulus at the national level, LDC can better channel the previous untapped sources of finance to address their priorities. As Hao-Liang just now, you mentioned that INFFs is a newly initiated mechanism which is aimed to help LDCs and other vulnerable countries to build the institutional capacities, processes, and systems that underpin the financing policy making, as vividly amplified by the successful story in Djibouti. So the growing number of the LDCs are using this mechanism to address the specific financing challenges and enable a more sustainable financing architecture. That is why my department, UNDESA, is committed to sharing widely the experiences and the lessons learned from this mechanism in its implementation. DESA plays a major coordinating and convening role to bring the key partners together to support this mechanism. Much of the analysis on the sustainable financing at the global level is done through the Interagency Task Force on Financing for Development, which, as Hao-Liang said, chaired by me, by DESA. So in response to the increased momentum for the demand and the support of INFFs, including by the G20 as a leading group, DESA has developed a series of tools and guidance documents to support this national efforts. So in a very close collaboration with partners such as UNDP, OECD, IMF, we put together step-by-step guidance for building the blocks under this mechanism. This guidance drew lessons from the successful stories and also from relatively less successful stories. We hope that this facility will be further improved to allow all participating countries to work with our development partners to ensure that our joint work respond to the priorities that countries set in their national processes. So that I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee. I'm sure many countries represented here will really look forward to the kind of collaboration you mentioned in the UN and to the support that DESA is providing on INFFs and also LDCs. So thank you very much for this. Let me now turn to Lao PDR, and afterwards we'll ask UNICEF's Deputy Executive Director to speak. And I have the pleasure to introduce Her Excellency Ms. Phona van Ottavan, Vice Minister of Planning and Investment. And Lao PDR is on the path to graduating, which is expected in 2026, and has built a process of national financing dialogues involving a wide range of stakeholders to inform the financing strategy for its 9th National Socio-Economic and Development Plan and the transition out of the LDC status. So, Vice Minister, we would love to hear from you about your experience and how do you see the value added of INFF. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, Mr. President, Ministers, Vice Ministers, Under Secretary General, Special Representative, Deputy Secretary General, Deputy Executive Director, representative from government, from UN and development partners, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. First, let me thank to INFF Facility for inviting me to this very important event and to speak about the integrated national financing framework experience and also briefly on the Lao development situation. Laopedia has made significant progress in recent decades with a remarkable GDP growth enabling infrastructure, trade and investment, and poverty reduction, and better and longer life, marked by the UNGA decision in 2021 to endorse the CDP recommendation for Laopedia graduation by 2026. However, since then, the challenges have been healing up. COVID-19, as mentioned by others, greatly affected our health system, our children education and private sector, and determined people's livelihoods. This alone justify the extended preparatory period to ensure graduation would not interrupt the sustainability of Lao people development pathway. Recent rapid inflation, especially of food and agricultural inputs, have caused further harm. And of course, the increasingly frequent and severe weather events have worsened the situation. Managing these challenges requires significant resources. However, with the limited budget and private investment in SDGs, our development finance gap is widening. This is why the integrated national financing framework is so timely and important. During the last 2 years, the government is supported by the UN, and today we have the UN coordinator to Laopedia, Madam Sarah Sekenes, also with us today. And the SDG fund and increasing number of development partners, the World Bank, the OECD, the GGGI, for instance, have worked to identify priority policies required to finance our 9 national socio-economic development plan. And a multi-stakeholders effort and a more than 20 days of workshops led to a consensus of 54 policy actions. There are a few that I would like to highlight. First, the policies aim to increase coherence between revenue generation and the investment promotion regime, social and investment priorities. The financing strategy for the national plan based on the INFF calls for the reduction in the role of natural resources extraction in the revenue generation, and in any case to be subject to the strict environmental impact assessments. Similarly, the financing strategy prioritizes the review of fiscal policy and of the investment promotion regime, which has allowed generous tax exemptions to broaden the tax base. Additionally, the financing strategy contains recommendations to support the Laopedia in achieving the goals of National Development Plan on track, maintain the prioritization of social services, especially investment in health and education is critical. Laopedia is focused on public finance to achieve the SDGs for children. INFF should consider social spending and investment for children and as critical for Laopedia, and also to strengthen community-based approaches is essential to both build resilience to further climate crisis and pandemics and other shocks, and also to reach the most vulnerable communities in Laopedia. which is why Lao PDR is focused on system strengthening, for example, on health, education, nutrition, etc., and to reach children and young people, women and vulnerable communities, and help build the resilience for long-term stability and sustainability. Secondly, is financing strategy help us to prioritize long-term sustainability. A chapter on greening the economy contains policies to mobilize green ODA, to green our fiscal policies, and update our regulation to attract more green investment. The financing strategy also calls for the increasing budget allocation for health and education and the management of donor transition to social sectors and to secure our investment in people. Thirdly, and especially importantly here in Doha, the prospect of LDC graduation have been well integrated with policies dedicated to optimization of and mitigating for the future losses of financial international support measures, which was extensively highlighted by my Excellency Deputy Prime Ministers of Lao PDR and other heads of delegates during the LDC summit yesterday. This ultimately means graduation should be the rewarding, not penalized. The draft smooth transition strategy, in fact, shares a number of policies with the financing strategy, which bring me to what I think are main sources for the INFF approach. There are key accomplishments that I would like to highlight today. The first is policy coherence. Working with all relevant stakeholders has allowed us to have a more systematic overview of development policies. Most of the challenges we face resolve around the policy trade-off, revenue generation versus environmental sustainability, fiscal space versus attractiveness, among others. The second advantage is the structured process that brought us from diagnostic to policy formulation, allocating or associating all stakeholders early on for consensus around the challenges was essential before deciding an agreement on solution. Lastly, we have spent a significant amount of time preparing implementation, and we now have a streamlined M&E framework with responsibilities and simple means of verification. Despite this achievement, there are still a long way before we have sufficient SDG financing in Lao PDR. Let me highlight in particular 3 challenges ahead, which are also why we call for further support by INFF Facility and development partners. First, the transition of policies to sectoral and local levels. The financing strategy remains a national level policy document whose successful implementation will require dissemination, collaboration, and updated work plans and budgets of ministries and local administration. Secondly, the realignment of development program to these new priorities. I had a privilege to participate in the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation in Geneva last December. And what I gathered from the exchanges is that there is a need to better align development partners' priorities with national plans, as well as programs at the scale to tackle systematic change. There is what we require of financing for development. Third and final, a conference to maintain a multi-stakeholder sectoral coordination. And the support from SDG Fund joint program has ended, which may constrain and delay implementation. Such support should be a key objective of INFF facility and development partners ahead. Excellencies, the distinguished representative, let me end my presentation here, and I look forward to receiving further support and collaboration to implement INFF in Lao PDR. I thank you again for inviting me to join this very important event. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vice Minister, for sharing your experience, really very comprehensive, and also a lot of remaining tasks to be done. Thank you very much. We look forward to continue the partnership. And let me turn to UNICEF Deputy Executive Director, Mr. Omar Abdi. Mr. Abdi, UNICEF, has recently joined the INFF Facility, right, to support, strengthen support to LDCs and other countries. And UNICEF has also a lot of focus on supporting women and the children, and they have deep expertise in the areas of public financing in this regard, right? So can you tell us, why it is important for UNICEF to engage with INFFs? What support you are offering to LDCs, and what outcome do you expect to achieve through this partnership? Over to you. Yeah,
thank you, Haulian. First of all, it's a great privilege to be here today among this distinguished panelists. Let me also say that UNICEF is excited to be part of the INFF, to join UNDP, UNDESA, OECD, and other partners, to leverage our experience and field presence to accelerate progress towards closing the persistent SDG financing gap. We believe that the INFF are important mechanism to accelerate progress around the SDGs. Even though the challenges ahead are significant, we've heard from the ministers this afternoon that the opportunities to leverage the INFFs to expand and improve the quality of financing, including for social and sustainable development. Public finance is essential to achieving national goals related to survival, development, and protection of children. The pandemic made the challenge of spending on social sectors in LDCs even more significant than it already was. For example, children have been disproportionately impacted. Approximately 100 million additional children are facing multidimensional poverty as a result of the combined impact of pandemic, climate crisis, and conflict. Despite these challenges, government revenue is the largest source of SDG financing in developing countries, and particularly relevant for social sector spending. Investments from international development partners, diaspora communities, and the private sector can complement, but not replace domestic financing for the SDGs. It is therefore key that we work together to expand domestic spending and ensure that it is efficient, effective, equitable, transparent, and prioritized to accelerate progress in critical sectors. We are asking countries and governments to do more and better with existing resources. Enhancing efficiency of domestic financing can unlock critical resources for national development priorities. For example, we know that 2% of GDP spending on education in low and middle income countries is lost due to inefficient spending and management. Therefore, INFFs are critical instrument to help governments both prioritize spending within existing budgets across social, environmental, climate, and inclusiveness priorities, and also improve the policy context, as we've heard from the ministers, in order to use existing resources to their fullest extent and facilitate the transition to greener economies. Finally, let me conclude by recommitting UNICEF to support the development of INFFs and advance public finance for children. Today, our public finance teams work in 144 different countries side by side with UNDP, line ministers, and ministries of finance at central and decentral level. Thank you, Haldian.
Thank you very much, Omar. I really appreciate these insights. And I know that we at the UNDP are excited to continue our partnership, working together to support the INFF, facility to our developing countries. Thank you very much. Now, Comoros, is the LDC that will soon finance its finalizing its financing strategy. Okay, and I would like to invite the Secretary General of the government, Mr. Abdul Razak, Ibrahim, and to really share with us about the financing challenges that the Comoros faces, the development of your country's financing strategy, and the changes you are implementing as it is delivered. So, Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais féliciter les organisateurs de cet événement et puis les éminents panélistes qui m'ont précédé. Et bien évidemment, j'ai eu l'opportunité de présenter le cas des Comores en ce qui concerne le cadre national de financement intégré. Je vais commencer par quelques éléments indiquant les principaux défis de financement pour les Comores. J'indiquerai ensuite l'utilité de l'INFF pour le gouvernement comorien et puis enfin quelques éléments de stratégie de financement, de stratégie retenue par le cadre national de financement intégré. Après avoir finalisé l'évaluation sur le NFF au niveau national, on a eu quelques recommandations. D'ailleurs, ces recommandations qui nous ont permis d'établir ou d'élaborer notre cadre national de financement intégré. Nous avons ici quelques conclusions qui nous permettent de partager ici, à commencer par le déficit de financement disponible, sachant qu'il existe encore des grandes opportunités pour mobiliser davantage au niveau national. On a fait le constat de l'absence ou plutôt du cadre de concertation qui peine d'être opérationnalisé en ce moment, malgré qu'un décret a été déjà pris et que le cadre lui-même a été déjà mis en place. On peut marquer aussi les difficultés de procédure de mise en œuvre qui se trouvent complexes avec des faibles capacités d'absorption au niveau national, un cas de cloisonnement entre secteurs, les sources de financement ainsi que les processus de budgétisation, et puis quant aux décisions et puis des stratégies qui se veulent très fragmentées. J'indiquerai ensuite quelques raisons qui ont poussé le gouvernement comorien à mettre en place le cadre national de financement intégré. Déjà, l'Union des Comores dispose, à partir de l'année 2019, de son plan qui est intitulé Plan Comores émergent, un plan de développement très ambitieux à l'horizon 2030. Ce plan a été assorti de programmes, de projets phares et structurants qui permettent de lancer et de mettre les bases de l'économie comorienne. Alors, aussitôt mis en place ce document qui a été validé en décembre 2019, la COVID-19 s'est invitée dans tous les pays du monde, donc qui a touché tous les pays, y compris les Comores. Donc, les raisons pour lesquelles nous avons opté pour ce cadre, c'est de permettre à ce que le financement de ce plan Comores émergent soit fédéré, qui puisse fédérer les différentes sources de financement existantes autour de la stratégie, qui permet d'établir un véritable écosystème de financement du développement, qui permet d'identifier les mesures et les réformes nécessaires pour optimiser la mobilisation et l'alignement de toutes les ressources de financement à notre développement. En ce qui concerne notre cadre conceptuel, les réformes qui ont été identifiées et qui doivent être mises en place nécessitent le renforcement des capacités d'absorption, la coopération au développement sud-sud, le cadre de gouvernance en matière de coordination, la planification, le cadre budgétaire, les investissements et financement du secteur privé, les fonds d'investissement destinés à la diaspora. Nous avons identifié comme source de financement potentiel pour les Comores les fonds d'investissement destinés à la diaspora, la finance verte et bleue, et puis s'attaquer avec des réformes à ce qui est l'évasion fiscale et la fiscalité. En dernier élément, comme je l'avais annoncé, quelques éléments de la stratégie de financement. D'abord, sur quelle méthodologie? Quelle est la méthodologie que ce cadre s'est fixé? D'abord, c'est d'identifier les besoins de financement, identifier clairement les objectifs de la stratégie par rapport au plan commun émergent, ainsi que son plan d'action, mais aussi d'identifier et indiquer en matière de gouvernance l'intégration des politiques de planification et de financement, permettant d'aligner à la fois les politiques sectorielles, les politiques de planification nationale et les financements, et puis intégrer tout ce qui est question systémique, notamment la cohérence entre les financements, les stratégies, mais tout en prenant en compte les risques qui se présentent au sein de cet environnement. Par rapport à cette stratégie, je pourrais aussi indiquer deux petites parties, notamment une partie sur la mobilisation des financements à travers le cadre de financement intégré. Ici, on cible les finances publiques, en ciblant plus particulièrement la coopération internationale, notamment à travers l'aide publique au développement, la coopération sud-sud, la finance bleue et verte, mais aussi le financement privé qui est destiné au financement interne et international, le financement innovant qui est le transfert des diasporas, et puis la finance islamique. La deuxième partie concerne l'architecture rationnelle du cadre national de financement intégré, la mise en place d'un cadre de pilotage stratégique qui permet de faire le suivi de la mise en œuvre, mais aussi qui permet de mobiliser en même temps les financements dans un seul panier, un seul cadre de financement de notre cadre plan de développement. Les processus de réforme qui doivent être ancrés de façon effective dans le plan commun émergent, identifier et mettre en place des outils de planification et de suivi de la mise en œuvre du cadre de développement de notre pays, mais aussi de dresser des mesures et des réformes liées aux contraintes institutionnelles. En deuxième partie, concerne la mobilisation des financements qui sont d'origine publique, mais domestiques. Ici, on a mis en phase les recettes intérieures. Nous avons des recettes budgétaires très étroites, impactées par la fraude fiscale, les difficultés de recouvrement, l'informalité, les exonérations et puis et d'autres activités. La pression fiscale qui se trouve aujourd'hui de 7,8% en 2021, en dessous du potentiel. De nombreux manques à gagner dont l'ampleur reste incertaine, notamment les arriérés, les impôts, des sociétés, les taxes foncières, les droits douanières et puis les exonérations. En matière de dette publique, nous avons constaté un taux d'endettement aujourd'hui de 31,3% du PIB, qui est en dessous du seuil de la zone CFA, mais ces recettes intérieures et valeurs des exportations qui se trouvent trop basses pour garantir la viabilité de la dette pour de nouveaux emprunts. Des difficultés quant à la gestion stratégique, notamment la gestion de l'endettement, le plan de réforme de la gestion de la dette et puis la mise en place d'un comité national de la dette publique. En matière de financement public international, nous avons identifié des sources importantes des investissements à travers la loi de finances 2022, 72% du programme d'investissement public. Nous avons constaté des projets fragmentés en dehors des systèmes nationaux, des faibles taux d'absorption et de mise en œuvre, d'un nombre restreint de partenaires techniques financiers, mais potentiels supplémentaires, ces difficultés d'absorption qui doivent être résolues. En matière de recettes intérieures, les principales réformes se dressent autour des réformes au niveau des finances publiques, notamment à travers le renforcement des capacités des administrations et des procédures, d'assurer une politique fiscale juste et efficace et de refléter les priorités dans la gestion des dépenses, qui est une réforme importante au niveau national. En ce qui concerne la coopération internationale, nous avons mis l'accent sur la gestion stratégique du financement public international qui voudrait appuyer la réforme des finances publiques par une gestion efficace de l'aide, pouvoir accroître la mobilisation des ressources, les capacités de caissement et l'alignement de l'aide publique aux priorités nationales. Et enfin, de saisir les opportunités de la coopération sud-sud et triangulaire pour financer le développement de notre pays ainsi que la stratégie de développement des Comores. Alors, en matière d'investissement du secteur privé, les enjeux et actions stratégiques se positionnent autour du climat des affaires, notamment en matière d'investissement du secteur privé comorien, la production des chaînes de valeur nationales, l'inclusion financière, le renforcement du financement bancaire et l'attractivité des investissements étrangers. En matière de politique de financement innovant, nous avons comme enjeu d'orienter les fonds de la diaspora vers les priorités du plan commun émergent, de mobiliser la finance islamique et de faire de la finance bleue et verte un sujet transversal pour les Comores et dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre de notre plan Comores émergent. Voilà les quelques éléments que je voudrais partager dans le cadre de l'exemple des Comores dans la mise en place du cadre national de financement intégré. Je vous remercie.
Yeah, thank you very much, Secretary General. You clearly have presented a case where INF seems to really adding value to the national development process, financing debates, and so forth. So let me maybe move to the middle. So, next, let's hear from a video from the OECD. OECD is an important partner in this, support, to LDCs, developing countries on INFF. The director of development cooperation could not be here, unfortunately, but she recorded the video. So let's hear the video from Ms. Pilar Garrido. Yeah.
2023 would be a critical year to lay the foundations of a new global financial pact in support of the most vulnerable countries. As international stakeholders engage in systemic reforms, we should always keep in mind the specific needs of least developed countries and the implementation of the Doha Program of Action. LDCs should participate fully in these reforms, and the OECD stands ready to help them. We are aware of the challenges, and especially the challenges of accessing financial resources. Official Development Assistance, or ODA, to LDCs amounted $57.8 billion in 2021. From 2019 to 2021, members of the OECD Development Assistance Committee gave on average 46.2% of their ODA to LDCs. These figures might seem important, but they reflect worrying trends. First, ODA to the LDCs is declining, admittedly in part due to graduations. Second, the share of grants is also declining. LDCs are particularly exposed to debt sustainability issues and have very limited fiscal space to contract loans. Third, at the same time, the financing needs of LDCs are growing due to the fallout of COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, as well as reduced government revenues and inflation. As a result, more and more countries are having trouble accessing financing for sustainable development. Solutions presented by financial innovation still need to prove their efficiency in an LDC context. For example, LDCs accounted for less than 1% of all green social sustainability and sustainability-linked bonds, less than 6% of blended finance, and less than 8% of climate funds. This is why the OECD teamed up with United Nations in support of the Integrated National Financing Framework Facility right from the beginning. In a fast-changing development finance system with more than 1,000 instruments to choose from, keeping up with the pace of innovation is challenging. Through our work on transition finance, we have documented the fact that many LDCs, although they are eligible for a number of funds, are not able to access those funds because they lack the capacity to build the pipeline of projects and submit applications. Because of these capacity constraints, they opt for suboptimal funding solutions. To address those constraints, the INFF Facility ambitious to identify in a detailed manner the needs of LDCs for technical assistance and capacity and match them with affordable, quality, and neutral expertise. We have tried and tested such matchmaking mechanism in the context of our project called Tax Inspectors Without Borders, and so we know it works. For our members, such a mechanism has the power to make their bilateral technical assistance more effective and demand-driven, and to reduce gaps and overlaps. For LDCs, it ultimately means equitable access to financing and the most recent financial innovations in support of their sustainable growth. The partnership with the UN was obvious for us since we have complementary roles. In the field, the UN identifies special needs, and at the OECD, we match those needs with the expertise of our members. As we design this mechanism, we are encouraging our OECD members to participate in the initiative and to liaise and support LDCs. The European Union, Italy, and Sweden joined the INFF facility from the onset as core partners. Now is the time for this group to expand. Together, we can make a difference and make finance work better for the sustainable development of LDCs. Thank you.
Yeah,
2023 would be a critical.
So thank you, Ms. Guarido, for this message. After OECD are partner, let's also hear then two more last speakers, also very important. One is from the Special Secretary General Special Representative on Disaster Risk Reduction, Ms. Mami Mizutori. UNDRR is supporting the work on INFFs to ensure that risk reduction and management is mainstreamed throughout the financing reforms countries are designing and developing through the INFF at the country level. So, Ms. Mizutori, can you please share your perspective on why INFFs offer an opportunities to strengthen investment in risk reduction and the role that UNDRR is playing in this effort? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So today we heard from almost all the distinguished representatives that INFF is helpful. And this is, I think, very good news. It might sound obvious, but that's good. But we also heard that the reason why they started to use it is because disasters derailed them, whether it's a pandemic, which is a disaster that happened by a biological hazard, or whether it's extreme weather events by climate change. And of course, a lot of countries have what we call geophysical hazards, earthquakes, tsunamis. And all of these just derail financial planning, erode sustainable development, and pushes countries into indebtedness. And many countries like the SIDS, because of their level of income, once they're there, they can't get concessional borrowing. And what happens is that their indebtedness just grows. So this is the reason why, answering the question, it's very important to put disaster risk reduction and prevention into INFF. Because the big gap that most countries have right now is that they are not investing in prevention. What does that mean? They don't put the extra $1 when they construct their resilient infrastructure, which turns out not to be resilient, or they don't try to have regulations that direct the flow of money into reducing risks. Sometimes they just create new risk. So this is the big gap. And what we thought, talking about with DESA, is that it's important to prioritize where your money goes into, whether it's education or whether it's infrastructure, whether it's health. But it's also extremely important how you invest that money. A very simple example, building a school. If it's not built resilient, it may just collapse with a disaster, and it not only kills and maims, but it deprives children of their education opportunity, and that will lead to a lifelong of deprivation from a good career path, which is of course erosion of development. So this is why we believe that it is extremely important that INFFs have the disaster risk reduction prevention element in it. The good news is that in 2022, the member states committed at the Forum for Financing for Development that INFFs should be aligned to their own national disaster risk reduction strategies, that investment in resilience should be done. And this is what DESA and UNDRR is now working on together, so that the commitment of the member states can be rolled out. Exactly what we're doing is that now we are together establishing a guidance on how this can be done. And at the end of this month, at the G20, we will present it, because India, as the presidency of the G20 of this year, decided to establish a working group on disaster risk reduction under the G20 architecture. And there will be the first meeting of the working group on disaster risk reduction of G20 in India at the end of this month. So we will present this document to G20, because as Akim was saying, G20's leadership is very important. And after that, we would like to, together again with DESA and hopefully with UNDP too, pilot this in several LDCs. And in this way, we hope that we can reverse the current trend in which we think that on average, only 1% of budget is invested into prevention in many countries. Change this so that the percentage will grow. And next time when a disaster strikes a country, whether it's an LDC or any developing country, it doesn't erode the development gains. It doesn't derail the finance, the fiscal policy. This is why we're doing this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, for really clearly outlining why, this is an important issue and what exactly UNDR is adding value. So thank you very much. Now to our last, but not least, speaker, Her Excellency and Vice Minister of Belgium for Development Cooperation, Ms. Heidi Brombots. After hearing the reflections from our developing country LDC, governments, and also from international partners who are providing support, and we really would like to hear from you. Your thoughts and reflections. What do you see the potential of the INFF? What would be the priorities? That we can work together. In the future to support our developing countries to use INFFs effectively to expand the fiscal space for development. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you very much for all these interventions and for sharing these very interesting experiences. I think it's really enriching and it really makes me reflect on what it actually means also for Belgium. Belgium is having a voluntary national review during the 2023 high-level political forum. And I think this also makes us reflect on what our resources are and how we mobilize them. Maybe just 4 things that or let me limit it to 3, the rule of 3 takeaways from this conversation. First of all, first takeaway is very much for me the ownership and partnership that I hear in this exercise of INFF. Very much the ownership that I've heard about national priorities, really taking the lead. And I think that is a very welcome idea, but definitely also as a development partner, we very much support. But at the same time, I also hear next to ownership, a lot of learning. I hear countries saying like it helps us not only to focus, but also to understand our own structure and our own financing, both sources and challenges. At the same time, I believe it's an exercise in partnership, and development partners do have a role to play. And it's very important, I believe, to go beyond, let's say, a light touch involvement, but really to make it a deeper involvement, not only limited to sharing Excel files with figures and numbers on who contributes what, but very much, I believe, in terms of planning together and getting organized, getting the development support also organized as part of a source of financing. Maybe linking it to a notion that was used a lot years ago, but is less on the agenda today. It's division of labor to a certain extent as well. And so I think it's very much that balanced approach between both ownership and partnership that I see as my first takeaway from this conversation. My second takeaway is very much on quantity and quality of finances. We hear concerns in terms of access. We hear cloisonnement, les silos, la complexité of finances. And I think we also have a responsibility as development partners there. We have to reflect on how we organize our resources. We have to reflect on challenges on fragmentation. We have to reflect on why is it so complex to access certain resources. And I believe we have a responsibility there also together with our partner countries, and maybe not look at challenges each time with a response in terms of funds or specific resources, but how to integrate them. Very happy to hear disaster is not a topic apart, but it's very much part and parcel of planning in a sustainable way. I'm very happy also to hear reflections about both green and blue finances as well. So that is also the aspect of quantity and quality of finances. And of course, also the challenges around debt. And then the third takeaway, I believe, again, looking at ourselves and the roles that we play, we have certain instruments. I think this exercise is also to partially aiming at bringing together certain instruments to simplify, to define new ways forward. And I think we then definitely also have to commit as international partners to stick to them, to avoid parallel exercises or to add layers to it, creating additional burdens. And I believe we've heard testimonies of countries that are very committed, putting a lot of effort in it. And so I think it is good to then take it forward and to avoid additional layers so that we can then focus on effective development. Those are my takeaways. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This really summarizes our discussion in a way. I think what I would only say is that I think the INFF framework is really a very powerful tool, right? Because you put public-private resources in the mix. You put the domestic and the international resources in the mix, and you have the 4 quadrants, right? That allows you to look at how you can, work together in partnership to increase the pie of each of these quadrants, so that ultimately you increase the volume of financing that LDCs are looking for. And the last thing I would say is that we know that INFF is not a one-off exercise. It's not a point in time exercise. It is a process. It is a multi-stakeholder approach, right? It is a repetitive and iterative process that can be, undertaken, along the development, the planning process and the implementation process. So I think this meeting really showcased the value of the INFF approach and also the value of partnership. So let's really work together, continue this partnership. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation, especially ministers. Thank you.